In the unforgiving dust of the Arizona territory, a woman's compassion became her damnation. And her damnation, well, that became her destiny. This is the story of Juliet Bellwether, a lonely widow who, on a night shattered by thunder and gunfire, made a choice. A single choice that would unravel her entire world. She found a bleeding Apache warrior on her fence line, and she dragged him into her home. She hid him from the law, from a hanging rope, under the very bed she slept in. She thought she was just saving a life, a simple act of mercy. She had no idea that in the eyes of his people, a life saved was a soul claimed. She didn't know that the man gasping for breath in the darkness beneath her would soon look at her, not with gratitude, but with the unwavering conviction that she was his bride. This isn't just a story of survival. It's the harrowing account of how a single drop of pity ignited a war for one woman's heart in a land that showed no mercy at all. The wind that swept across the plains of Arizona in '83 was a mean old thing. It carried the grit of the desert and the ghosts of promises broken right along with it. For Juliet Bellwether, it was the sound of loneliness itself. It had been 6 months. 6 long months since a fever had taken her husband Daniel. It moved with the speed and the finality of a rattlesnake strike, and just like that, he was gone. Now the sprawling sky and the rust-colored mesas were her only companions. The small ranch they'd built with their own two hands felt more like a tomb with each passing day. The storm broke just after dusk, a furious biblical downpour that turned the dry earth to a thick, sucking mud. Rain hammered the tin roof of her small homestead, and every single drop was a reminder of just how alone she was. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of chicory coffee long gone cold in her hands. She watched the lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in stark, black and white flashes. And it was in one of those flashes that she saw him. He wasn't at her door. He was clinging to the fence post of the horse corral, a hunched figure barely visible through the sheeting rain. He staggered, fell to one knee, and then somehow he rose again, a testament to a will that was clearly stronger than his body. Another flash of lightning, closer this time, lit him up like an actor on a stage. He was Apache. His black hair was plastered to his face. His buckskin tunic was dark with rain, and something else. Something thicker. Blood. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced right through the numbness of her grief. Every story she'd ever heard, every whispered warning in town, screamed at her to bar the door, blow out the lantern, and pray to God he moved on. The newspaper from Prescott was a month old, but she'd read it a dozen times. It was filled with tales of Apache raids, of settlers found dead in their beds. The people in the nearby town of Redemption Creek spoke of the Apache as if they were demonic spirits, not men of flesh and blood. But her Daniel had been different, a geologist by trade, a philosopher by nature. He'd respected them. He'd even traded with them peacefully. "They are a people of this land, Juliet," he used to say, his voice full of a gentle conviction she missed like a physical limb. "We are the intruders." The figure out there in the rain collapsed again. This time he didn't get up. He was going to die out there, in the mud, just 100 feet from her door. Juliet's heart hammered against her ribs. This was madness. She was a widow, alone and vulnerable. Helping him wasn't just crazy, it was suicide. Yet she couldn't shake the image of his struggle. He wasn't a warrior on a raid. He was a wounded animal seeking shelter from the storm. Her fear was at war with a deeper, more stubborn instinct. The same instinct that made her set a splint on a bird's broken wing. The same compassion Daniel had loved in her. With a choked sob that was half terror, half resolve, she grabbed the heavy shotgun from its hooks by the door. She pulled her husband's oilskin coat over her nightdress. The lingering scent of him, a small, painful comfort. She didn't light a lantern. The lightning would be her guide. The mud sucked at her boots as she crossed the yard. When she reached him, he was barely conscious. She nudged him with the toe of her boot. A low groan was her only answer. He was younger than she had thought, his face all sharp angles and high cheekbones. A deep gash ran along his ribs. a crude, oozing wound. A bullet had torn through his shoulder. He was burning up with fever. "Can you understand me?" she whispered, her voice snatched away by the wind. His eyes flickered open. They were black, bottomless, and for a moment held a spark of fierce, untamed pride. He said nothing. This was her moment to turn back, to leave him to his fate. But Daniel's voice echoed in her memory, gentle and clear. "Compassion is never a mistake, Julie." With strength she didn't know she possessed, she hooked her arms under his. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She dragged him, step by agonizing step, through the mud and the driving rain, back toward the small, warm light of her home. The door creaked open, a gateway between two worlds. She pulled him inside, out of the storm, and into a danger far greater than any she could have imagined. The wooden floorboards groaned as she laid him down, the water and blood from his body immediately staining the pine. He was a secret she now had to keep, a fuse she had just lit, and she had no idea when or how it would explode. The world outside her cabin was a maelstrom, but inside the only sounds were the frantic beat of Juliet's own heart and the stranger's ragged, shallow breaths. She barred the door, her hands trembling so violently she could barely slide the heavy wooden bolt into place. The Apache lay on a heap of old quilts by the hearth, drifting in and out of consciousness. Working by the low light of a single lantern, she cut away the remnants of his buckskin tunic. The wounds were worse than she'd feared. The gash on his ribs was deep and inflamed, and the bullet in his shoulder. It was still there, a lump of lead poisoning his blood. Her medical knowledge was basic at best. Her supplies were meager, a bottle of whiskey, a few strips of clean linen, and a sewing kit. She cleaned the gash as best she could, her stomach churning. He flinched and his hands shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. His dark eyes, clouded with fever, bored into hers. A single guttural word escaped his lips. "Shh," she soothed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm trying to help you." He seemed to understand her tone, if not her words. His grip loosened. For the next hour, Juliet worked like a woman possessed. She poured whiskey over the wounds, earning a sharp hiss of breath from the man. Then she set about the grim task of digging out the bullet with the tip of a sterilized knife. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Every scrape of metal against bone sent a jolt through her own body. Finally, the lead slug came free. She stitched the wounds closed with clumsy, uneven sutures, her hands slick with his blood. As she bandaged him, she took a moment to truly look at him. His body was a roadmap of a hard life, covered in old scars that spoke of battles she could only imagine. Around his neck on a leather thong hung a single, polished piece of turquoise. She knew she couldn't leave him on the floor. Anyone who came to the door would see him immediately. The only place to hide him, the only place concealed and large enough, was under her bed. The old iron frame bed Daniel had built stood high off the floor, with a thick quilt that draped nearly to the floorboards. It took all her remaining strength to half drag, half carry him to the bedroom. She settled him on a pallet of blankets she pushed into the deepest shadows underneath. He was delirious now, muttering in his own tongue. She placed a tin cup of water beside him and prayed he would remain silent. She scrubbed the blood from the floorboards until her knuckles were raw. Exhausted, she finally collapsed onto the bed, lying directly above the wounded man whose life was now tied to hers. Sleep was a distant country she could not reach. Morning arrived with a cruel gray light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. But that peace was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Not one horse, several. Juliet's blood ran cold. She peered through the edge of the curtain. Sheriff Brawdy and 3 other men from Redemption Creek were riding into her yard. Brawdy was a big man with a florid face and pale, calculating eyes. He'd made his unwelcome interest in Juliet clear even before Daniel's funeral, masking his greed for her land with a thin veneer of neighborly concern. She quickly checked on the Apache. He was asleep, his breathing still labored. She smoothed the quilt on her bed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Taking a deep breath, she pasted a look of weary composure on her face and opened the door just as Brawdy was about to knock. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What brings you out so early?" "Morning, Juliet," Brawdy said, tipping his hat. His gaze swept past her into the dim interior of the cabin. "We're on a hunt. A band of Chiricahua jumped the reservation line, stole some livestock. We tracked one of them this way, lost the trail in the storm, but we reckon he was wounded." One of the other men, a lanky deputy named Riggs with a mean-looking scar on his cheek, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her porch steps. "Seen anyone, Mrs. Bellwether? An Apache running scared?" "No," Juliet said, her mouth dry. The lie felt like sandpaper on her tongue. "I've seen no one." Brody's eyes narrowed. "You sure about that? And a lone woman like you? You'd be a tempting target." His tone was laced with an insinuation that had nothing to do with the Apache. He was reminding her of her vulnerability. "I keep a shotgun by the door, Sheriff. I can take care of myself," she said, forcing a coldness into her voice. "Mind if we take a look around?" Brody asked, though it wasn't a question. "He was bleeding pretty bad. Might have tried your barn." Her mind raced. The barn was clean, but what if she'd missed something? "If you must," she said, stepping aside. She stood on the porch, a statue of feigned indifference, as the men searched the barn and corral. They found nothing. But Brody wasn't satisfied. He lumbered back to the porch, his presence filling the space. "We'll check the cabin, too. Just a quick look," he declared, pushing past her before she could object. Panic seized her. Riggs followed him in, his spurs scratching the floorboards she had scrubbed so desperately. Brody's eyes scanned the main room, lingering on the hearth where the quilts lay. "Looks like you had a chilly night," he commented. "The roof leaks," she lied smoothly. "I was catching the drips." He grunted and moved toward the bedroom. Juliet's heart stopped. She could only watch, paralyzed, as he pushed the bedroom door open and stepped inside. She heard the creak of the floorboards as he walked around. She heard him open the wardrobe. She held her breath, praying the man under the bed wouldn't make a single sound. The silence stretched for an eternity. Brody reappeared in the doorway, a thoughtful, suspicious look on his face. "All clear," he said, but his eyes told a different story. They were fixed on her, searching for the slightest crack in her composure. "You let us know if you see anything." "Of course, Sheriff," she managed to say. As they mounted their horses, Brody turned back one last time. "It's not safe out here for you, Juliet. You should think about selling. I know a man who'd give you a fair price for this land." The threat was unmistakable. She watched them ride away until they were gone. Only then did she sag against the doorframe, her legs trembling. She had survived the first test. But as she listened to the faint, pained breathing coming from under her bed, she knew the sheriff's suspicions were a smoldering ember, and the slightest breeze would fan it into a raging fire. For 3 days, Juliet lived a life of dual realities. To the world, she was the grieving widow, tending her cattle, mending fences. But in secret, she was a nurse, a jailer, and a conspirator. Her world had shrunk to the confines of her small bedroom and the wounded man hidden within it. She called him Kale in her mind, a short, hard sound that seemed to fit the sharp planes of his face. He spent most of the first 2 days in a fevered delirium. Juliet spoon-fed him broth and willow bark tea, changing his bandages, listening to the torrent of Apache words that poured from him. On the third evening, the fever broke. She was dozing in a chair by the bed when a sound startled her awake, the soft clink of the tin cup. She looked down to see him propped on one elbow, drinking the water she had left. His eyes were clear, lucid, and fixed on her. The intensity of his gaze was unsettling. It was not the gaze of a grateful patient. It was the gaze of a hawk studying its prey. "You," he said, his voice a dry rasp. It was the first English word she had heard him speak. "Yes," she whispered, "you're awake." He slowly pushed himself into a sitting position under the bed. He looked at the clean bandages on his shoulder and ribs, then back at her. "You did this," he stated. "It wasn't a question." She nodded. "You would have died in the storm." He was silent for a long time, his eyes never leaving her face, assessing her, reading her in a way that made her feel transparent. "Why?" he finally asked. The single word carried a universe of meaning. How could she explain it? That she had done it for her dead husband's memory. That she had done it out of a moment of pity she was beginning to deeply regret. "I couldn't leave you to die," she said simply. He absorbed this, his expression unreadable. "The men who came with the star," he said, touching his chest. "They hunt me." "Sheriff Brawdy," she supplied. "He thinks you stole cattle." A flicker of something, contempt perhaps, crossed his face. "The white rancher, Miller. His fence is new. It cuts our path to the water. His cattle drink what is ours. We took back what was owed." His English was broken, but his meaning was clear. He spoke of it not as theft, but as justice. Juliet felt a pang of confusion. She had been raised to see the world in black and white, settlers and savages, law and chaos. This man was blurring those lines with every word he spoke. Over the next few days, a strange routine developed. During the day, he remained hidden, silent as a shadow. At night, she would bring him food, and they would talk in low voices. He told her his name was not Kale, but Harkin, which meant fire. He was not Chiricahua, as Brody had claimed, but of the White Mountain Apache. He was the son of a chief. And the men who had ambushed him weren't just Brody's posse. They were rivals from his own tribe, traitors who had aligned with the ranchers for profit. Brody had been there to finish the job. Juliet, in turn, found herself telling him about Daniel, about their dream of building a life in this harsh land, about the crushing loneliness that had followed his death. She spoke more to him in those few nights than she had to anyone in months. On the fifth night, as she was changing the dressing on his ribs, he stopped her, placing his hand gently over hers. His skin was warm, his touch sending an unexpected jolt through her. "You have saved my life," Harkin said, his voice low and serious. "The breath in my body is now a gift from you." "I did what anyone would have done," she murmured, trying to pull her hand away. He held it fast. "No," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Not anyone. In my world, things are different. When a spirit is brought back from the edge of the darkness, it is forever tied to the one who brought it back. A debt is created, a debt of blood and spirit." A cold knot of apprehension tightened in Juliet's stomach. "A debt? I don't want anything. I just want you to heal and go, before Brody comes back." "Going does not pay the debt," Harkin continued, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. The simple gesture was more intimate than any she had known since Daniel. "You saved the life of a chief's son. This is a great thing. It changes your path. It changes mine." "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He finally released her hand. His expression was a mixture of solemnity and something else she couldn't name, a fierce possessiveness that made the air in the room feel thick and heavy. "I am saying," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "that you have given me my life. In the eyes of my people, and in the eyes of the spirits, my life now belongs to you. And your life is now protected by mine. You are claimed by my spirit. Where I go, you go. You are my woman now, my bride." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and shocking. Bride. Juliet stared at him, speechless. The man she had saved from death was not just a grateful fugitive. He was a warrior who believed she now belonged to him, bound by a code she didn't understand and a claim she could never accept. She had hidden him to save his life, but in doing so, she had unknowingly sacrificed her own freedom. The danger was no longer just outside her door. It was breathing the same air, living under her roof, and looking at her as if she were already his. The week that followed Harkin's stunning declaration was a tightrope walk over a chasm of fear and confusion. Juliet tried to dismiss his words as a fever-induced delusion, a cultural misunderstanding. But the way he looked at her had changed. The quiet gratitude was gone, replaced by a steady, watchful possessiveness that unnerved her to her core. When she brought him food, his eyes followed her every move. When she spoke, he listened with an intensity that felt like he was memorizing the very sound of her voice. He had made his claim, and in his mind, it was as binding as any vow spoken before a preacher. Juliet became a prisoner in her own home. She avoided the bedroom as much as possible, choosing to sleep in the uncomfortable rocking chair by the cold hearth. She spoke to him only when necessary, in clipped formal tones, but his presence was inescapable. It was in the faint scent of the herbs she used on his bandages, in the extra plates she had to prepare and hide, in the constant gnawing fear of discovery. Her trips into Redemption Creek for supplies became ordeals. The town was a small, insular community where gossip traveled faster than a stagecoach. Her first trip after the storm was met with a barrage of intrusive questions. Martha Higgins, a woman whose piety was matched only by her nosiness, cornered her outside the general store. "Juliet, dear, we were all so worried about you," Martha began, her beady eyes taking in Juliet's weary appearance. "Sheriff Brawdy said he stopped by. Said you seemed a bit rattled." "I was fine, Martha. Just tired," Juliet replied, pulling her shawl tighter. "It's a shame about that Apache, though," Martha continued, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say he vanished into thin air. Brawdy thinks he must have crawled into a coyote den and died. But I don't know. They're cunning, you know. Like snakes." Her eyes darted around as if expecting to see a warrior lurking behind a pickle barrel. Juliet bought her flour and salt, her hands shaking as she counted out the coins. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back. Was she acting differently? Did she look guilty? The pressure from Sheriff Brawdy was more direct. He made it a point to check in on her twice that week, his visits unannounced and unwelcome. He'd ride up, his bulk blocking the sun, and invite himself in for coffee. He'd sit at her kitchen table, making small talk while his eyes roamed her cabin, searching. "Still haven't reconsidered my offer?" he asked during his second visit. "This is no life for a lady. You're getting thin, worn out. I could take this land off your hands. Make sure you're set up comfortably in town." "The answer is still no, Sheriff. This was my husband's home. It's my home," she said, her voice firm. "Daniel's gone," Brawdy said, his voice losing its folksy charm and taking on a hard edge. "He's not coming back. You need a man to look after you, Juliet. A white man." The implied threat was clear. He was the law. He could make her life easy, or he could make it impossible. His suspicion was a palpable thing. He noticed the extra vegetables missing from her garden. He commented on how much firewood she seemed to be burning. Each observation was a small jab designed to keep her off balance. Juliet knew she was running out of time. Harkin was healing quickly. His Apache blood, combined with her care, was knitting his flesh back together with astonishing speed. He was already moving around in the cramped space under the bed, testing his strength, his impatience a low hum of energy she could feel through the floorboards. One evening he confronted her. She had just returned from another tense trip to town and had slumped into her chair, the weight of her deception pressing down on her. "The man with the star. He bothers you," Harkin said from his hiding place. His voice was stronger now, deeper. "He wants my land," Juliet said, too tired to hide the despair in her voice. "He wants me to be afraid, so I'll sell it to him." "He wants you," Harkin corrected her, his tone flat and dangerous. "I see it in his scent when he leaves. The scent of a coyote circling a lone sheep." The primitive accuracy of his words sent a shiver down her spine. "He's the sheriff. There's nothing I can do." "There is always something to do," he countered. "In my world, a man like that is challenged. His weakness is found and used against him." He paused, and she could hear the rustle of the blankets as he shifted. "Soon, I will be strong enough. I will not hide under this bed like a child." The thought terrified her. Harkin confronting Brawdy would mean a bloodbath. It would mean her own ruin. "No, you can't. They'll hang you. They'll question me. I'll lose everything." "You have already lost everything," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You lost your husband. You are losing your home. You hide from the world. This is not living. This is waiting for the end." His words were a cruel but honest mirror. She was just waiting, waiting for Brawdy to find an excuse, waiting for her supplies to run out, waiting for the loneliness to finally swallow her whole. That night something shifted. The net was closing in. Her secret was becoming too heavy to bear. But Harkan's words had planted a seed of a different kind of fear, the fear of her own passive existence. For the first time she wondered if she wasn't just a victim of circumstance, but a fighter. Just like the man hidden in the shadows of her room. The question was, whose side was she fighting for? The days bled into one another. marked by the rising sun and the ever-present tension of the secret she kept. The dynamic between Juliet and Harkon began to undergo a subtle yet profound transformation. The fear, while not gone, was now interwoven with a thread of something else, a reluctant, dangerous intimacy. Forced into proximity, they began to exist not as captive and captor or savior and survivor, but simply as two people in a shared space. He, no longer confined by the worst of his injuries, started to reveal more of himself. He was patient, observant, and possessed a quiet dignity that Juliet found herself grudgingly respecting. One night, finding it impossible to sleep, she sat at the kitchen table, tracing the rim of her coffee cup. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned to see Harkin standing in the doorway of the bedroom. He had emerged from his hiding place, moving with a predator's silence. He wore a pair of Daniel's old trousers she had given him. His bare chest, crisscrossed with old scars and the new healing wounds, was starkly illuminated by the moonlight pouring through the window. "You should not be up," she chided, her heart fluttering with alarm. "The floor is cold," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The chair is not a good place for sleep." He walked over to the hearth and with surprising gentleness added a log to the embers, coaxing them back to life. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face. He didn't return to the bedroom, but sat on the floor by the fire, a respectful distance from her. "Tell me of Daniel," he said. The request, so simple and unexpected, caught her off guard. Hesitantly at first, then with a cathartic rush, she spoke. She told Harkan of Daniel's kindness, his insatiable curiosity, his belief that different people could coexist. As she spoke, she realized she wasn't just describing her husband. She was describing the life, the love she had lost. When she finished, her cheeks were wet with silent tears. Harkin remained quiet for a long moment, watching the flames. "He was a strong spirit," he said finally. "His song is still in this house." He then told her of his own loss, a younger brother killed years ago. He spoke of the traditions of his people, of how the spirits of the dead live on in the mountains and the wind. In that quiet, firelit space, the walls between their worlds became thin. He was not the faceless savage from the town's fearful whispers. He was a man who had loved, who had lost, who was governed by a code of honor. She was slowly, hesitantly, beginning to understand. His claim of her as his bride had initially felt like a threat of ownership. Now she began to see it through his eyes. It was a vow of protection, a sacred intertwining of fates. He believed her spirit had called to his, and his duty now was to shield that spirit from harm. It was a terrifying, yet strangely compelling notion. The next afternoon, while she was kneading dough, he emerged from the bedroom again. He was breaking her rule about staying hidden during the day, but she found she didn't have the will to scold him. He held something out to her in his palm. It was a small, intricately carved bird, fashioned from a piece of scrap wood he must have found under the bed. He had used the small knife she'd given him for his food. The details were exquisite, each feather etched with precision. "For you," he said, "it is a wren. She is small, but her song is stronger than any storm." Juliet took the bird, its smooth wood warm against her skin. It was the first gift she had received since Daniel's death. It was a simple, beautiful thing, and it shattered a piece of the wall she had built around her heart. She looked from the carving to his face, and for the first time, she did not see a threat or a burden. She saw Harkin. Later that day, as she was hanging laundry on the line, she saw a dust cloud on the horizon. Brawdy. A wave of nausea and fury washed over her. She ran inside, her voice a harsh whisper. "He's coming. Get back under the bed." Harkin moved with swift silence. As Juliet straightened the quilt on her bed, her hand brushed against the carved wren she had placed on her nightstand. She clutched it in her fist, its solid shape a small anchor in a sea of panic. When she opened the door for Sheriff Brody, the look on her face was different. The fear was still there, but it was now tempered with a hard, defiant anger. The wren in her pocket was a secret talisman, a reminder that she was not as alone as the sheriff believed her to be. Her heart, once solely the property of a dead man's memory, was now a contested territory, and she was no longer certain which side she wanted to win. Sheriff Brody dismounted with a deliberate slowness, his eyes already dissecting the homestead. searching for a flaw in Juliet's story. This time, he wasn't alone. Deputy Riggs was with him, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his gaze cold and empty. There was no pretense of a friendly visit. They meant business. Juliet, Brody said, his voice devoid of its usual false charm. We need to have a look inside. You have no right, she began, standing her ground in the doorway. You have been here twice already. This is harassment. Brody produced a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. Got a warrant this time, signed by Judge Peterson himself. Martha Higgins reported hearing voices from your cabin the other night. Said it sounded like a man's voice. Not mine, and certainly not yours. Juliet's blood turned to ice. She had been so careful, but the wind could play tricks. Or perhaps she and Harkon had not been as quiet as they'd thought. That's absurd, she scoffed, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Martha Higgins hears voices in her sleep. Maybe, Brody said, pushing past her into the cabin. But we're going to make sure. Riggs, start with the bedroom. The world seemed to slow down. Juliet watched in horror as Riggs, a brutish grin on his face, strode toward the bedroom. She wanted to scream, to fight, to throw herself in his path, but she was frozen by the certainty of what was about to happen. Brody stood in the center of the room, blocking her path, watching her with triumphant, predatory eyes. The silence from the bedroom was deafening. Riggs was taking his time, enjoying the moment. She heard the scrape of the wardrobe door, the thud of a boot being kicked, the rustle of clothes being thrown to the floor. And then, a different sound, a soft, almost inaudible thump. Riggs backed out of the bedroom, his grin wider than ever. He was holding something between his thumb and forefinger. It was a single dark blue bead, intricately painted, the kind used to adorn Apache clothing or moccasins. It must have fallen from Harkin's tunic. Well, well, Sheriff, Riggs drawled, dangling the bead. Look what I found tucked under the bedpost. Don't look like it belongs to Mrs. Bellwether here. Brody's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. The game was over. Where is he, Juliet? He demanded, his voice a low growl. The Apache. Where are you hiding him? I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered, her last pathetic attempt at defiance. Don't lie to me, Brody roared, taking a step toward her. You've been harboring a fugitive, a murderer. That's a hanging offense, in case you forgot. Suddenly, the floorboards of the bedroom creaked loudly. A shadow fell across the doorway. Harkin emerged from the room, rising to his full height. He was no longer the broken, feverish man she had dragged in from the storm. He was healed. His eyes burned with a cold fire, and though he was unarmed, he radiated an aura of such lethal intent that both Brody and Riggs took an involuntary step back. Leave her alone, Harkin said, his voice calm and deadly. Riggs recovered first, his hand flying to his pistol. It's him, the savage. But Harkin was faster. In a blur of motion, he crossed the space between them. He didn't rush at Riggs, but at the heavy oak table. With a powerful shove, he sent it crashing into the deputy's legs, knocking him off balance. The pistol fired, the bullet tearing harmlessly into the ceiling, showering the room with plaster dust. Before Riggs could recover, Harkin was on him, disarming him with brutal efficiency. He struck the deputy once at the base of the neck with the edge of his hand, and Riggs crumpled to the floor unconscious. Brody, stunned for only a second, drew his own revolver. Don't move, you red devil! He leveled the gun, not at Harkin, but at Juliet. He grabbed her arm, yanking her in front of him, using her as a shield. The cold metal of the gun barrel pressed against her temple. I'll kill her, Brody hissed, his face slick with sweat. I swear to God, I'll kill her right now. Harkin froze, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes locked on Brody's. The room was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Juliet could feel Brody's panicked, ragged breaths on her neck. She was trapped between two worlds, between two men, and the slightest movement could end her life. You see, Brody panted, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I'm still the law here. Now you're going to walk outside nice and slow. You're going to get on your knees, and I'm going to put a bullet in your head for what you did to my deputy. Harkin's eyes flickered from Brody to Juliet. In that brief, silent exchange, she saw a universe of rage, regret, and fierce, protective resolve. He had revealed himself to save her, and in doing so, had walked into a trap. "Let her go," Harkon said again, his voice dangerously low. "This is between us." "It was always between us," Brody spat back. "But she made her choice." He began to drag Juliet toward the door, the gun never wavering from her head. For Harkin, the choice was impossible. Surrender and die, or fight and risk her life. The lie had finally unraveled, and the consequences were about to be paid in blood. The harsh afternoon sun was blinding as Brody dragged Juliet out of the cabin. The world outside, which had been her sanctuary and her prison, was now to be her execution ground. Harkin followed them, his movements measured, his hands held slightly away from his sides. He was unarmed and exposed, his face an unreadable mask of cold fury. "On your knee," Brody yelled, shoving Juliet away from him. She stumbled and fell to the dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs. Brody kept the pistol aimed at her, forcing Harkin to keep his distance. "I said on your knees, savage!" Harkin slowly, deliberately, knelt in the dust of the yard. He never took his eyes off Brody. There was no fear in his gaze, only a chilling, patient hatred. "You see, Juliet," Brody said, his voice laced with a sick triumph. "This is what they are. Animals, easily brought to heel. You should have trusted me. You should have sold me the land when you had the chance." His confession hung in the air, confirming what Juliet had suspected all along. It was never just about the law or a stolen cow. It was about greed. "Now," Brody said, turning the gun from Juliet to point directly at Harkin's chest. "It's time to end this." It was in that moment of distraction, as Brody savored his victory and shifted his aim, that everything changed. Harkin had not been kneeling in surrender. He had been waiting. As Brody's finger tightened on the trigger, Harkin's hand shot down, scooping up a handful of the fine, powdery dust of the yard. With a flick of his wrist, he flung it directly into Brody's face. The sheriff cried out a strangled curse, instinctively raising a hand to shield his eyes. The momentary blindness was all Harkin needed. He exploded upwards from his kneeling position, a blur of motion. He didn't charge Brody head-on, but dived for the sheriff's legs in a low tackle. The shot went wide, the bullet kicking up dirt harmlessly behind him. The two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Brody was bigger and heavier, but Harkin was faster, stronger, and fueled by a righteous fury. He fought not like a brawler, but like a force of nature. He twisted out from under Brody's weight, landing a series of precise, debilitating strikes to the sheriff's ribs and shoulder. Brody grunted in pain, his grip on the revolver loosening. Harkin seized the opportunity, grabbing the sheriff's wrist and slamming it against the ground until the gun fell from his numb fingers. Juliet scrambled for the dropped weapon, her hands closing around its heavy, warm metal. She pointed it at Brody, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. Harkin rose, breathing heavily, and dragged the gasping, winded sheriff to his feet. He held Brody by the collar, his knuckles white. He could have ended it right there. He could have taken the sheriff's life, and no one would have blamed him. But he didn't. Instead, he looked past Brody, toward the road. A small cloud of dust was growing larger. More riders. Juliet's heart sank, thinking it was more of Brody's men. But as they drew closer, she recognized them. It was Mr. Peterson, the owner of the general store, and two other ranchers from town, their faces etched with concern. They must have seen Brody and Riggs ride out, armed with a warrant, and followed out of suspicion. "What in God's name is going on here, Brody?" Peterson demanded, reining in his horse. His eyes took in the scene. Riggs unconscious in the cabin, Juliet holding a gun, and the sheriff held captive by the very Apache he was meant to be hunting. "He's a killer," Brody choked out. "He attacked us. She helped him." "He lies," Harkin said, his voice ringing with authority. He gave Brody a violent shake. "This man did not come for justice. He came for this woman's land. He ambushed me, with my own people as traitors. He paid to kill me. He did not want a prisoner. He wanted a corpse, so no one could speak of his crimes." The ranchers looked from Harkin's burning eyes to Brody's terrified, dust-covered face. They had known Brody for years, known his greed and his bullying nature. They had seen how he'd been circling Juliet's property since her husband's death. "Is this true, Juliet?" Mr. Peterson asked gently. She looked at Harkin, standing proud and defiant in the sun. the man who had claimed her, protected her, and shown her a strength she never knew she possessed. Then she looked at the cowering sheriff, who represented the civilized world that had tried to crush her. The choice was clear. "It's true," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Every word of it." The reckoning was swift. Broady's authority crumbled into dust. Faced with 3 witnesses and Juliet's testimony, his blustering threats evaporated, revealing the cowardly opportunist beneath. The ranchers took him and the still groggy Riggs back to Redemption Creek, promising a full investigation by the U.S. Marshal. When they were gone, an unnerving silence fell over the homestead. It was over. The secret was out. The danger had passed. Juliet and Harkin stood alone in the yard, the space between them charged with unspoken words. He turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You are safe now," he said. "And you?" she asked. "Where will you go?" "I will return to my people. I will deal with the traitors who sided with him," he said. He took a step closer, and his voice softened. "My claim is not a chain. You saved my life. I have now saved yours. The debt is paid. You are free to remain here, in your world." He was giving her a choice. She could stay here, on the land she had bled for, and try to rebuild a life in a town that would forever whisper about the widow who hid an Apache under her bed. Or she could face a different future. She looked at her small cabin, which had once felt like home but now seemed like a cage of lonely memories. She thought of the whispers, the judgment, the life of quiet desperation that awaited her. Then she looked at Harkin. She saw the wild freedom of the mesas in his eyes, the promise of a life that was not about waiting, but about living. It was a dangerous, uncertain path, but it would be a life of her own choosing. "The wren's song," she said softly, touching the small wooden bird still in her pocket, "is stronger than the storm." A slow smile spread across Harkin's face, a rare and beautiful sight. He understood. He held out his hand. Without a backward glance at the home that held her past, Juliet Bellwether laid her hand in his. Together they walked away from the ranch, 2 survivors of different worlds, their spirits bound not by debt or by force, but by a choice made in the dust and sunlight of the Arizona territory, ready to face a new horizon together. And so the story of Juliet Bellwether doesn't end with a closed door, but with an open horizon. She stepped away from the life she knew, not as a captive, but as a partner, choosing the untamed freedom of the wilderness over the gilded cage of civilization. Her tale is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most profound rewards, and that the lines we draw between worlds are often as fragile as a desert mirage. It speaks to a truth buried deep in the heart of the Old West, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the act of choosing compassion in its very face. If this journey into the heart of the untamed frontier moved you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the story. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of drama and destiny. And most importantly, subscribe for more true stories from the annals of history. Your support allows us to keep these incredible histories alive. Thank you for listening.